Hello everybody, welcome back to Psych Motivation. Let us talk today about personality characteristics as they relate to motivation. So this is chapter 13. You can tell we're getting towards the end of the course. I hope everyone's staying well and safe at home as we negotiate our time in this pandemic. Oh, by the way, these are what I refer to as Boots babies. So our cat Boots, which is that big rear end that you see kind of in the base of the picture, that's Boots. She wanted to move in. She came up on the porch after eating on the porch for a while on the doorstep, said, "Why don't you bring me in?" I brought her in. I thought she might be pregnant, so we'd get her kittens born in the house, and then we can give away the kittens because they're socialized. They won't be feral at that point. And one of my colleagues at Columbus State took all 6 of Boots babies, so to speak. So there they are. Hella active, being all crazy. So let's start about talking state versus trait. So as we have a personality discussion, Annika wants to get in on this. I think it's important to understand the difference of state trait, terms that we're probably totally familiar with. In the context of this lecture, both state, that is our personality constructs, might motivate us towards certain behaviors or at least predispose us to certain motivational states. And I mean, states will do that, and traits, will do that as well. So we're going to look at both in this module. Traits exist over the long haul. They're largely thought, right, to solidify during adolescence. That's when we see that period of time, as Erickson describes, that we begin to develop an identity which includes our traits. It happens earlier than that, but I'm going to say they solidify during that time. And they may reflect a genetic predisposition. Right? States are typically responses to the environment. They're temporarily activated attitudes and behaviors. The nice thing about states, I think, is we can prime people to enter states pretty effectively in the laboratory, and they resemble traits. So this is a tool in our setting. So the behaviors and attitudes are what they are for the most part, regardless of the source, whether it's state or traits that are motivating it. The results that we see are pretty much the same. Lexi, what are you doing? So Lexi made an appearance. Individual differences then, and here when we talk about dispositional qualities, trait qualities, we're looking often describing in terms of individual differences. So happiness, arousal, control, let's discuss these. First with happiness, why do different people have different motivational and emotional states even in the same situation? And this reflects who we are as individuals, our life history, our genetic predispositions, the requirements of our current situation, all of these. So we may in fact, for example, let's take happiness. Happiness, extroversion generally leads to happiness. Neuroticism, on the other hand, tends to lead to unhappiness. But we have an emotional set point, so happiness and what we describe as happiness is relative to the individual. Right? So how does this work then? Extroversion and happiness? Well, extroverts, greater capacity than introverts to experience positive emotions, stronger and more sensitive behavioral activation system. And remember, the BAS is the approach stimulus that often operates outside of awareness. So if we have a trait extrovert, right, then they probably have a more active BAS, and then they experience more approach behaviors, which might be correlated to a greater extent with happiness. So they demonstrate often an eagerness to approach potentially rewarding situations, and that's how the BAS operates within those people. Potential reward, people with high BAS activation tend to approach it rather than avoid it. Right? Does anyone, what would be the flip side to the BAS? Anyone? Is the BIS, which is the behavioral inhibition system. Right? So what do we see then as a result of this eagerness to approach potentially rewarding situations on behalf of extroverts? Greater sociability than introverts typically. Greater social dominance than introverts, which may increase a sense of power, and according to Spinoza, an increase in a sense of power would equal joy. And greater venturesomeness, that is, the desire to experience adventures, experience different things, and perhaps to take chances than introverts. And that's one part, that's kind of the party line in introversion versus extroversion in this context, right? I also discussed introversion and extroversion in terms of cognitive processing. I think might be, in large part, a more useful explanation. But by now, one thing we should be painfully aware of, or joyfully aware of, for me, is that psychologists differ. And we subscribe to different theories and different ideas, and we go through this process of trying to generate empirical tests to provide support for our theories or not. And we go all the way back to the beginning of the course, which is time to start to review when we talked about the beauty of mid-range theories, that is, testable theories, right, rather than grand theories, which have been largely eschewed by psychologists at this point in time. So neuroticism and happiness, well, greater capacity for those with higher level or increased levels of neuroticism, right? Greater capacity than emotionally stable individuals to experience negative emotions, stronger and more sensitive behavioral inhibition system, as I referenced before. So more active BAS in extroverts, neurotics, maybe lower level BIS, higher level BIS activation. So they have a general eagerness to avoid potentially punishing situations. And the cognitive element of this too is the appraisal of a potential situation as being rewarding and or being punishing. You can see how the cognition also plays into this as well, to the extent that I tend to tilt towards ambiguous situations as potentially rewarding, as opposed to tilting towards an ambiguous situation being potentially punishing, right? So we see with neuroticism then this eagerness to avoid potentially punishing situations, greater avoidance behavior, and emotional distress as a result of this. And often part of this avoidance leads to, ultimately, in hindsight, feeling like they missed out, right? So this is another component of neuroticism. Questions about that? There we go, okay. Well, arousal. Let's talk about arousal's contribution to emotion. A person's arousal level is mostly a function of how stimulating the environment is. So this is more of a state issue. That is, our arousal can be activated by the features of the environment in which. So people engage in behaviors to increase or decrease their level of arousal. They have probably a preferred arousal set point and will, when they're feeling bored, then do engage in activities to increase their arousal, or if they become over-aroused, then they might detach from stimulus, in fact, to manipulate their arousal downward. Cats, I mean, cats are fascinating in arousal. When you overstimulate a cat, it's not a good thing. You can sit there and pet a cat, and then they're fine, and they're fine. I have some cats, you know, that want 2 or 3 pets, and then they're good to go. If you continue to pet them, after that point, they've hit their threshold point for their desirable arousal. They become overstimulated, then they want to maybe bite, scratch, or run away. So we can observe in most species this desire to self-stimulate or self-separate from arousing phenomenon. When under-aroused, people seek out opportunities to increase their arousal level. How many people are doing that during this pandemic? How many of you are honest God, like, I gotta find something to do. I'm going crazy with boredom. If I stay in this house one more minute, that'll be the end of me, right? So in this case, you can see that temporally, kind of situationally, many of us are sharing in kind of an under-arousal and seeking out, you know, whatever situational elements we could put in our lives to maybe enhance our arousal. When over-aroused, people seek out opportunities to decrease their arousal levels, right? Because increases in environmental stimulation become aversive at that point, and they undermine performance, whereas decreases are pleasurable and enhance performance. And if, I guess you know what's coming, because I'm talking, you know, overperforming and underperforming. Yeah, we're going to do a different version of the Yerkes-Dodson curve, right? But the inverted U curve, right? And basically, I know you guys have heard it a million times, right? What we see as at low arousal states, right, our performance quality is relatively low. At high arousal states, because of the distraction, our performance level can be relatively low. We achieve our best performance for most of us at a moderate arousal state, right? So it's like, not to get too high is being able to control our emotionality, so to speak, or in this case, control our emotionality on the low side, but increase it to peak arousal, which would then generate peak performance. So insufficient stimulation, well, the worst examples of this might be sensory deprivation. And this is when you're in a rigidly unchanging environment that provides no stimulation whatsoever. And people will do this on purpose. They'll put themselves into a sensory deprivation environment, like a tank where they're floating in body temperature water. It's absolutely dark and absolutely soundless. Most people will report experiencing hallucinations, anxiety, as a result of that profound understimulation in a relatively short period of time. When we think about maybe incarcerating people and putting them into solitary confinement, you can imagine the extent of under-arousal that they're experiencing. If you're, let's say, in your cell for 23 hours a day and you're allowed to get out an hour a day to exercise or maybe get yourself cleaned up, and you're always alone in this regard, we can see that this is akin to a form of torture almost from a psychological perspective. Here in sensory deprivation study then, the nervous system prefers a continual and moderate level of arousal generated by environmental stimulation, right? So to take this stimulation away from people has severe cognitive consequences. So human beings thus harbor motives, at least it's thought, we harbor motives for counteracting insufficient stimulation and under-arousal. We may be chill for a while, but at some point we get motivated to get off our butts, right, and seek out some kind of arousal phenomenon. Now, for many of us who are now at home, and many of us that means being alone for protracted periods of time, question then, to what extent does the use of media fulfill arousal needs? Right? And are those needs changing over time, right? And kind of tacking on another question there, does anyone leave music or TV on in the background, right? To have that constant stream of potential stimulation. Now, my wife, when she's working, doesn't want anything on, no music, no TV, nothing, because she finds it to be a noxious stimulating and over-arousing. It competes with what she wants to do. I tend to like to have the TV on as background noise or white noise, all right, so to speak. So individual differences play into this. So excessive stimulation, over-arousal, what do we know? Well, overstimulating stressful environments can cause emotional disruption, anxiety, irritability, anger, and all those things might be present in my wife while she's working at home. Something as simple as knock on the door because a package has been delivered often makes her kind of anxious and tense or angry because it interrupts her train of thought or what she was doing, right? And that could represent then not only the emotional disruption but the cognitive eruption. And this might then interfere with her concentration, might increase forgetfulness or confusion. And think about your own study habits. What is the environment that you like to place yourself in while you're attempting to study? And this kind of gives you a picture of who you are and how you operate in this regard. Some people want to study with music, some people cannot for the life of them study with music, right? Sometimes the sounds in the dorm room are just way too much to handle and interfere. Other people find that kind of low-level stimulation in the background rewarding. And then physiological disruption. To the extent that we're aroused, and notice that this is an individual difference, then it's activating the sympathetic nervous system. And that's, the system that controls fight or flight reactions. So you can see that for someone who doesn't like kind of that background noise, if you will, this is directly impinging upon their sympathetic nervous system. It's activating the amygdala, and all the cascading effects from the amygdala activation are occurring. So we also then have motives for counteracting excessive stimulation and overload. And I mean, and as an aside now, with me working from home all the time, usually I do this in the classroom, and now I'm home all the time. My wife has already worked from home 4 out of 5 days a week and only went into the office 1 day a week, but she doesn't do that anymore. So now we're home all the time. We're in, under the stay-at-home order here in Columbus, Ohio. We have to work, it's a new adventure in controlling stimulation, either understimulation from not being able to go out, or overstimulation kind of from stepping on each other's toes. Right? She doesn't necessarily need me banging around in the kitchen when she's trying to concentrate on a conference call with customers or what have you. So these are all just real circumstances that we have to negotiate, and during the pandemic it's been challenging a lot of us to do this in a new way. Hey Penelope, what did you do with Annika? Are we trading cats? Can we get Annika up here too? Annika, come on sweetie. Alright, so credibility, the inverted U hypothesis. We see it all the time, but maybe because it's being tossed at us class after class after class, maybe we need to engage in some criticism as well, and maybe just not blindly accept it. The inverted U hypothesis doesn't apply to everyday affairs in which arousal levels change very little, right? So it's not a good explanatory tool in that regard. In psychology of emotion, we talk about the affective stream, which has something to do with this, that this unlabeled precursor to emotion that we might call affect. We have differences in preferences. Some people like variations, right, in that stream to a greater extent. Other people, Jesus, Penelope, other people like a relatively constant state. So that reflects an individual difference. Now, the inverted U hypothesis applies nicely to everyday sources of stimulation, caffeine, time pressures, etc. So these are things that we might operate under that could enhance our ability to perform a task or interfere with our ability. So let's talk about some people who need greater levels of arousal. Adrenaline junkie is a common term that's used now. The more precise psychological term is going to be sensation seeking. And this is a characteristic related to arousal and reactivity. People who are generally low in reactivity and high in an arousal need will be more likely to seek out stimulating events in their environment. That is, to be labeled sensation seekers. So it's related to a person's central nervous system, right? To the extent it requires change and or variability. So we can think first that this is kind of a personality characteristic, but notice it can also be a state-generated characteristic. If we've been deprived of sensory stimuli for a long period of time, then we're going to be driven, motivated to seek it out to a greater extent. If we've been overstimulated, then we seek to. So this is why I put this at the beginning of this module, is that the state and trait interact, right? And to understand, to have a better picture of the full idea, we'd better account for both the environmental circumstances, the state situation, and the person in it. And one person we haven't talked about in this class, I talk about him in Psych of Emotion, is Kurt Lewin. And he says if you want to understand behavior, it's a function of the person in the environment, right? So you can't separate the two. It's always an interaction that best explains observed behavior. So define the seeking then of very novel, complex, intense stimulations and experiences, and the willingness to take physical, social, legal, and financial risks for the sake of such experiences. So people who have, let's say, maybe an issue with gambling might be high in sensation seeking, right? And to put that money down with the possibility of losing that money causes this kind of arousal. It arouses the sympathetic nervous system, kind of a fight or flight. And then notice that often for people who are in that kind of sensation seeking mode, be it gambling, drug use, etc., what we typically see, or crime for that matter, is an escalation. So what was stimulating today might become kind of normal, and increasing stimulation is sought out. Now that's not true for all people in this area, but for some at least. So sensation seeking, they continually seek novel experiences. They're more willing to take risks, and notice sensation seeking might be part of the diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder and or psychopathy, certain definitions of sociopathy as well. Risk taking then, the sensations being worth physical, social, legal, and financial risks. Those risks add to the sensation seeking because they're unpredictable. And that's, I think that's interesting, because here we're talking about people who are almost embracing the unpredictable outcome. And that's very kind of contradictory to the picture that many of us paint that humans crave predictability. No, it's an individual difference. And the biological basis, hey, sensation seekers have low levels of MAO. Sensation seekers tend to have high levels of dopamine, hence their biochemistry favors approach over inhibition. And that's where the dopamine comes in. Sensation seekers tend to have relatively low levels of serotonin. Their biochemistry fails to inhibit them. So if we're to make gross kind of generalizations about dopamine versus serotonin, we have approach versus inhibitory processes. And then affect intensity. Let's think about this for just a moment. What we see here is data from subject 21. Here's data from subject 23, if you will. Affect stable individuals like to be in a relatively stable mood pattern. And they're going to attempt to engineer their life or control the stimulation in their life to allow them to have a relatively stable affective experience. Other folks, right, and this are far more comfortable with amazing highs and lows. Now, what this means, we're going to talk about on the next slide, but we have to stop for a minute because we're running out of space on this particular segment.